The Second World War came after a period of mass terror where all areas of society had been purged. The top military officials, as well as experienced members of government and experienced farmers, have been forcibly removed from society, with many deaths and many being forced into slave labour. So this is heightening Stalin's control, but weakening the Soviet Union. He built up industry, and with the 5-year plans and the highly centralised state planning organisation for industry called Gosplan, there were targets sent out to each region and supplies sent out by Gosplan, although these aren't the most efficient methods as the experts didn't necessarily always send them at the right time. However, this does mean that factories are there, and those that have previously produced tractors are able to turn around and produce tanks very quickly. So we have, for example, some factories renamed Tankergrad. Larger industries have been built up and infrastructure, so the people are still suffering, though, with few necessities in life, with Leningrad having reports of queues in 1938 of over 6,000 people in them for clothes and shoes, when clearly they would have been more efficient at work. There are incentive programs in place for workers, such as the Stakhanovites, but quality is often poor and factory managers manipulate figures so that they'll meet their targets. So industry isn't in the most positive place it could be when it's entering war. So in 1941, the Nazis have invaded the USSR then with Operation Barbarossa. Now, Stalin had been warned by his generals and by Soviet spies, but he didn't actually believe that this was going to be imminent. His industry, though, has been built behind the Ural Mountains, which act as a natural barrier. He also knows that he needs an alliance with the USA and Great Britain, but as with before the war, he's suspicious that the USA want Hitler to defeat the USSR, and then they're going to defeat Hitler. In the first 3 weeks of the war, the Russians lose 750,000 men, 10,000 tanks, and 4,000 aircraft. So from the 1943 Tehran conference, he's pushing and campaigning for the USA and Great Britain to open a second front. So, despite the initial attack appearing to have been a shock to him and him withdrawing from public life for a few days to his dacha and not participating in leadership decisions, this changes very quickly. So he takes total control. He makes himself Marshal of the Soviet Union, which makes him Commander-in-Chief. He also makes himself Premier. He is Chair of the Sovnarkom, which makes him Head of State. He is also General Secretary of the party, meaning he has personal control over the whole of the USSR. Now, he also makes a new organisation called the State Defence Council, the GKO, and he makes himself the People's Commissar for Defence, which puts him in charge of this. So it's putting him in charge of the war, and the GKO is created to coordinate economic and military production and is the most powerful body. With Sovnarkom, he is putting in place state power over party power. So he allows state power to grow. State ministers, not party bosses, are making important decisions. The Politburo are given important ministerial jobs, so they're coordinating state activity as well. And he ends mass terror, feeling that he can punish people after the war. It is a bit of a risky decision, putting himself in charge of everything, because he could be blamed for all the Russian losses. However, his propaganda machine we know is well honed. The Great Terror has sparked fear into the population, so people are less likely to be critical. And he also knows that he needs to kind of use incentives to bring people along. So he allows religion back into the USSR. Now, this is an appeasement of Red Army soldiers and their families. The army are mainly made up of peasants who are deeply religious. The Patriarch Sergei is given a home in Moscow, but he doesn't completely just trust him, so he keeps him there so he can keep an eye on him, and he has to sign a statement of loyalty to the USSR. The number of priests do begin to grow and churches open up so people can worship and pray for the souls of their dead relatives. In 1944, when the Patriarch Sergei dies, he's replaced by this man in this picture, the Patriarch Alexei, who in his first statement after assuming control of the church declared his profound affection and gratitude for Stalin and vowed to safeguard the church against mistakes and false steps. So he's not enthroned until Stalin agrees as head of the Russian Orthodox Church in 1945. So during the war then, Stalin focuses on defending key cities and allowing sieges to happen, not allowing people to leave the cities, trapping them, as he believes this will be bad for morale if they leave, if he evacuates. This shows a serious lack of care for his people, and the front is actually only 2,400 miles long. So when we look at the sheer death and destruction that happens as a result of this war, it does suggest that this is disproportionate. Leningrad alone loses 1 million people in its siege, with about 90% of people dying for hunger, and after the war 1,500 are actually arrested for cannibalism. But as we can see, Stalin continues to use his well-developed cult of personality to strengthen his leadership. And he even brings in religious imagery into his propaganda to show the achievements of the USSR, which carry on afterwards as a result of the Cold War. So, our Second World War then has left massive consequences for both Stalin and the people. There are 25 million people who are homeless now, and industry has produced 2/3 less than in 1940 by 1945. So there's a lot to do to rebuild this USSR. Stalin's estimated to have spent $190 billion on the war effort. Okay, that has been converted from rubles to dollars. During the war, they've gained $11 billion in American aid, called Lend-Lease, but their economy has shrunk by 20%. 40% of housing has been destroyed, and 12 million people fled eastwards away from the Germans who have been displaced, alongside the 18 million deaths. Stalin has decided to also use a policy of reprisals against German collaborators, and he also removed groups in the war, ethnic groups who he felt might collaborate with the Germans. So Poles, Romanians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Volga Germans, ethnic Finns, Crimean Tatars, Crimean Greeks, and other ethnic groups have all been punished in this way. It's estimated that about 6 million people were subject to forced migration, moved to the Far East or Central Asia. In some cases, more than 40% of deported population die of disease or hunger. In this year then, because of the developing Cold War, Stalin ups his game in the military and changes his title from Marshal to Generalissimo, a made-up title by him. This portrays him as a military genius and a saviour of the nation. He changes to being presented in a white uniform, which he designs personally, as we can see in the previous propaganda. And this military role is still needed as a result of this Cold War. So in propaganda, he's appearing in his military uniform and pretending to be this military genius. His focus clearly should have been on rebuilding his workforce. And between 1941 and 45, with 1,000 of the houses destroyed, he's prioritising rebuilding industry rather than rebuilding the workforce. However, you need industry, don't you, to pay for things. So in 1946, in January, the fourth five-year plan starts. The budget is really small, so house building isn't a priority. Where there is housing built, it tends to be on collective farm villages. So 4,500 farming villages were built in the Ukraine between 1945 and 50. Khrushchev would like a similar thing happening in Moscow, but Stalin vetoes it because they don't have the money. New factory towns are built, but again, accommodation is not a priority, neither is hygiene. So there's poor paving, sewage systems, and a lack of electrical light over the industrial buildings. The majority of workers are living in dormitories, with 20% living in mud huts. This leads to rampant disease and lice. So 88% of its investment is in heavy industry, and incredibly, the output reaches 80%. Siberia and the Ukraine reach higher levels than their pre-war outputs in some factories and mines, and production of consumer goods increases despite only 12% of investment into food and these. Reconstruction is clearly focusing on factories and not housing, and wages are low, so women have that dual role again of home and work, particularly as many of the men have died in the war. The average worker is taking an incredible 13 days sickness, and something which Stalin can't control is the widespread drought, coupled with severe shortages of agricultural workers. So production drops as there's an end for private farming that was allowed during the war. In government, there's a power struggle going on for the role of successor to Stalin. Beria, Stalin's secret police chief on the left, would look to be his natural successor after the Great Terror. However, there's a rival for this using culture and propaganda, Zhdanov, who's on the right. Now, he's directed by Stalin to direct the Soviet Union's cultural policy and to handle relations with Eastern Europe and make sure they're coming under the idea of the Soviet culture that he wants to roll out to the Eastern Bloc. Now, this is known as the Zhdanov Doctrine. So, the idea is that ideology and political learning will trump science, and political education is really important and must be prioritised. So, engineering, industrial production, and all those things, useful things, and the development of advanced munitions aren't as important. And he seeks to use the ideological purification of the party to restore the Kremlin's political control over the Kremlin and other areas of the Republic. So, this drought then in 1946 has caused widespread famine, where again we've got ranges of estimated casualties of 500,000 to 1 million people. So to counteract this for the workforce, you'll see they're able to eat in communal canteens, which there's an image on the right for you. These cost between 250 to 300 rubles a month, and you're entitled to 3 subsidised meals a day. These only cover 2.3 kilograms of meat and 6 eggs a month. However, those in lower positions, the young people in the workforce, can't afford this as well as accommodation. And these canteens are serving rotten food or other things because of the food shortages. So animal feed is also used, which naturally leads to illness. Sanitation is really inadequate, as we know from lack of sewers. Lice infestations, vomiting and dysentery are common. And there's a publicity campaign at this time encouraging people to use the toilet in a civilised fashion, washing their hands afterwards, which shows a lack of kind of pride of the Soviet people. Despite this, in this year there is an increase in the number of doctors, and the vaccines for malaria are now universally available. In government, Zhdanov continues his bid to be Stalin's favourite, and he organises the Cominform coordination of spreading his Zhdanov doctrine out to Eastern Europe and other communist states. In 1948, there's some continuity from during the war. There's 11,827 priests now, in comparison to 9,254 in 1946. In 1948 as well, Zhdanov and Beria continue to compete to become the next leader of the USSR. So in January, Zhdanov presides over a 3-day conference in the Kremlin, to which more than 70 composers, musicians and other music critics are allowed, and apparently he plays the piano to show them how they should be writing Soviet music, which naturally offends a phenomenal amount, but he wants to critically assimilate the cultural heritage of all nations and all times, to take what is most inspiring. That is his idea. So he's trying to kind of collectively create a Soviet culture. In June 1948, he sends Zhdanov, Stalin does, to a Cominform meeting in Bucharest to do the same thing. Zhdanov isn't as enthusiastic about this Soviet culture in Bucharest as somebody called Georgy Malenkov. This infuriates Stalin. He removes Zhdanov from all his posts and replaces him with Malenkov. Soon after, Zhdanov is transferred to a sanatorium and supposedly misdiagnosed, and he dies of heart failure in Moscow on the 31st of August 1948. It's possible that he was misdiagnosed deliberately. Now, his rival Beria then does not take any chances. So in 1948, Leningrad organises a trade fair to boost the post-war economy and support the survivors of the siege of Leningrad. This cost the city 642,000 civilian casualties with 400,000 evacuations. And it's attacked in official Soviet propaganda as well. So what they want to do is they want to restore their image. The Leningrad affair then, Stalin purges 100 officials and arrests and dismisses 2,000 in order to keep control of the party in the second most powerful city. Now, they're appearing to develop their independence from Moscow, and the people were industrial managers, scientists, university professors, so similar to before with the purges. This, though, however, is the base of where Zhdanov's support was. And as Beria signs the accusation, it's possible that he's trying to reduce the number of opponents he has in becoming the next leader of the USSR. Between 1950 and 58, the average economic growth rate is 7.1%, but Russia is in the space and the arms race with the USA, so military spending is high over consumer goods. With the focus being on military spending during the Cold War and the Fourth Five-Year Plan, by 1952 military spending is almost 1/4 of the government's budget. Grain production, though, is at pre-war levels now, and the statue you can see on the right here is at the top of an apartment building, showing a peasant woman and a worker on the same level. At this point then, Stalin also begins to get highly suspicious of doctors. He believes that there's a Jewish doctors plot in Moscow who are killing the Soviet leaders, and he made sure the media also published anti-Semitic material at this time. Many doctors are arrested, tortured and lose their jobs as a result of this purge. That is dismissed, though, after Stalin's death as having actual no evidence behind it. So Stalin dies on the 5th of March 1953, and like Lenin, he leaves no natural heir. There's mass corruption and people have paid for their positions, and industry is recovering, and the planned economy is the accepted way of economic production, highly centralised. The cult of personality and terror have proved valuable methods of control. So left to lead the Soviet Union are Nikita Khrushchev, the first secretary of the Central Committee, so the party boss; Beria, the head of the secret police; Malenkov, the premier of the USSR, so the head of state; and Molotov, the general secretary of the Communist Party.